watch, but it does tell the time. It's pretty good at that. And so, my name is Peter Houstel, and I'm joined here by Patrick Algier from GBTA. We'll introduce ourselves a little more thoroughly in just a minute, but today's webinar is all about our chapters. Are they worth the effort? And that's a scary question for some folks. I mean, we've all probably been managing chapters in some way, shape, or form for some period of time, and we occasionally may look at them and go, what's going on here? Am I burning calories in a positive way? Am I generating some worthwhile heat? And how do I know? So today we're gonna challenge some of our assumptions. We're gonna take a look at are they worth the effort? We need to justify the dollars that we spend as an association on our chapters, especially when we go to the CEO or the CFO and say you want to add a staff person, or you want to add a service, you want to add a program. All these things require some kind of rationale, and part of the problem we all typically have is we know how much the chapters cost. We're not really sure what they produce for us. It's like that advertising problem. I know how much my ads cost. I know that half of my advertising dollars are wasted. I just don't know which half. And we don't want to be in that kind of model with the chapters that we spend all this money on, because the CEO and the CFO are going to go, hey, I don't want to waste half of anything. In fact, I don't want to waste 5% of anything. So let's figure out whether we're wasting anything or not. So we go back to that age-old adage from Peter Drucker and probably half a dozen other great managers: you can't manage what you don't measure. So we're always trying to figure out what should we measure here. And so we want to measure what matters. And the corollary for that, of course, is that we tend to manage what we measure. But if we're measuring the wrong things, that can create some real problems for us. So we want to make sure that we're measuring the things that in fact matter. We want to count stuff because it can be counted, but we don't want to count it just because it can be counted. Because sometimes the things that count are difficult to count, or at least directly. So we want to make sure we're counting things that matter. And that's really key to this whole process of valuing the chapters in a way that allows us to figure out what number goes on the income side of our income and expense statement to offset the dollars that sit on the expense side of our income and expense statement. So why don't we take a minute here and learn a little bit about Patrick and me. Patrick, tell everybody about yourself.
Hey everybody, my name is Patrick Algier. I'm the Director of Volunteer Relations at GBTA. I joined the association in March of 2015. Prior to that, I was actually a member of GBTA for about 10 years. I've served as a chapter president. I've served on a leadership council. So I have a unique perspective of being both a member and also a staff member. And it's been really helpful. I do, in total, there's about 1,100 volunteers that serve in an active capacity at GBTA on a global level. My main focus over the last couple of years has been our 30 chapters and 9 affiliates. We have 14 global committees, and then I'm also responsible for about 8 meetings throughout the year where I both program and responsible for the successful execution of those meetings.
Cool beans. Okay, and as I said before, my name is Peter Houstel. I'm the CEO of Mariner Management. Peggy Hoffman and I started Mariner back in 2002. Both of us prior to that time had spent a great deal of time in the association world. I've been doing association stuff for almost a little over 3.5 decades, which means I've screwed everything up at least once. But prior to starting Mariner, I was the CEO of a national trade association that had chapters. And I remember the first time I went to a chapter meeting in New York, and I thought I should have been wearing a flak jacket because my predecessor had not developed what we might call a positive relationship with the chapter system. And so I spent a number of years trying to square that up. But I'll tell you, honestly, as a CEO, I often looked at the chapters and I said, I'm just not sure you guys are worth the effort. In fact, we had one chapter that actually started a competing trade show that really knocked us on our heels for a while until we negotiated a new arrangement with them. So chapters can be a positive force for your organization or a not so positive force, and we want to make sure that we figured out where that force should be. So, and I would be remiss also without mentioning that this webinar is brought to you by Bill Highway. And Bill Highway's been doing a wonderful job really reaching out to the chapter community to help people figure out what's working, what's not, what could be better, etc. So Without further ado, why don't we take a look at why you guys have chapters? So you have this thing called a chat box on your screen, and I'd like to know what the number one reason is that each of you have chapters, or at least the number one reason you think you have chapters. And type away. Add member value, direct service to members, engage the members, identify future leaders, local access to global services, all good stuff. Support our mission and add member value. I like that. Grassroots efforts, extension of brand and membership growth, face-to-face. So, Patrick, why does GBTA have chapters?
Well, it's funny, you know, we're a little bit of a unique situation again. Our chapters, not all of them, but our chapters actually existed before the global entity. So we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Our oldest chapter just celebrated their 65th anniversary. So, so our chapters, since they existed before us, some of them, you know, then from that existing group, the national entity spun off from there, and the chapter system has just grown over the last 50 years. So really, it's sometimes I ask myself, why did the chapters establish a global or national entity? You know, I mean, so for us, it's a little bit backwards, but really, it's, you know, it's for many of the same reasons that were put into the chat box. But I think engagement, succession planning, advocacy work is very, very important in our industry, and our members are very active in that.
Okay, so I can see the flip webinar being, why do we have a national headquarters?
Yeah, I think that would be
from the chapter's perspective. Yeah, and I know that in that association I worked with before, the chapters had preceded the national organization, and some of them thought they were the big dog in the yard. So that always makes things interesting as you're going forward. So in our next step, I'd like to sort of take a look at some research that Mariner and Horton Marketing Research did a while back. We published our 2016 chapter benchmarking study. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but there were some elements of that report that I think are germane to our conversation today. And I'm going to use that to sort of set up what we're going to do in terms of building the ROI matrix. And one of the first things, and this is what I think Patrick was alluding to, is that there are lots of different ways we can be organized, and each of those structures has some implications for how resources can be allocated. So if you have subsidiary chapters where they're wholly owned and fully operated by the national organization, the resource sharing is pretty intimate. Whereas with the separate affiliated groups, where they could tell you to take a hike anytime they wanted, the financial exchange tends to be substantially less, though the other issues can be substantially more difficult to deal with. And then obviously the way the membership is structured, contingent, non-contingent, unified, central, et cetera, all of those things have implications for how we might potentially allocate resources from the headquarters organization to the chapter system. And then, of course, we did look in terms of what's being spent at how associations support their chapters. And so as you can see here, most on average, the associations reporting in our survey suggested they had a little over 3 full-time employees focused on chapters, and about 6.5 or so that were secondary. You know, the chapters were secondary to their primary role. And if you sort of take that average of around 5 full-time equivalents at say $75,000 to $100,000 each in terms of payroll, benefits, everything else, you've got on average associations dropping $500,000 to support their chapters. And that may be a good number, that may not be a good number. Maybe it's not enough, maybe it's too much, don't know. But we need to sort of figure out as part of today's conversation how we justify that number and perhaps change it. And of course, we also found in our research that about 56% of the associations deal with chapters strictly through their membership department, and 27% had dedicated CRPs as part of their operating system. So, and Patrick, before I go to the next one, very quickly, how's GBTA set up for staffing purposes?
So about a year ago, I hired an employee, and that's the first. So in 2015, when I started, it was just me. And then earlier last year, we hired our first second person that's supporting the chapters. Their main goal and objective is to provide membership and marketing support to our 30 chapters. So it's teaching them best practices to acquire new members, retain their current members, and increase their event attendance through event marketing.
Okay, cool. So as one might suspect, there are lots of things that associations can do for their chapters, and our research suggested that the top 7 were in this order: most frequent to least frequent, event promotion, database management, dues collection, those kinds of things. And most chapters being event focused, that makes a lot of sense that the headquarters be focused on how do we make sure that their events are as good as they can possibly be. Because ultimately, I think as somebody said, and when we asked why you have chapters, we were looking at how do we move the mission and serve the member. So if, in fact, the chapters are delivering events to the members, they're delivering education and networking, that's going to be really important to the value that those chapters create. And then one of the other questions we asked folks in our survey was, what roles are most important to associations? And it sort of locked into 4 key areas: member engagement, leadership development, member recruitment, and marketing communications. What was interesting, though, is we asked them 2 questions: what's important, and how effectively are the chapters delivering on that? As you can see in this chart, there's a gap right across the board. So what the associations are expecting of their chapters is not being met by the reality that those chapters are delivering. So that's a place where we've got to ask ourselves the question: are we not spending enough money? Are we not allocating enough resources to the chapter system? Or is this just a black hole into which we're pouring dollars and not really getting much return? Maybe we shouldn't spend as much as we're spending. There needs to be some balance sort of achieved here. And so that's obviously a key question for us to ask in the course of this process. So Patrick, when GBTA looks at the chapter roles, which of these 4, if you had to pick one, would be really the number 1 item that folks would be focused on?
Member engagement, definitely. We, through the process that we've worked through, and we'll share a little bit more about this later, but we have a direct correlation at GBTA from member engagement to direct financial return back to the association.
Okay, good. Well, we definitely will be focused on that very shortly. And then, of course, we looked at what we would call the areas of concern with the associations. And let me back up a second here. I'm sorry, I skipped a slide there. Let me go back here. So the associations rank these areas, but a lot of times when they say the importance is greater than the effectiveness, one of the things that we typically find missing, however, is the data that justifies this assessment. Because oftentimes we'll ask people, well, how do you know? And they'll say, well, these people fill in their reports on time. And I'm going, well, that doesn't necessarily make an effective chapter. That just means they fill in their reports on time. And way too often, the metric against which we see chapters being assessed is one of organizational compliance rather than moving the mission and serving the member. So I think it's really important that we decide what it is that we're trying to measure here. And then we ask that question, well, what are you measuring? And most associations are measuring, as Patrick noted, membership, measuring retention and recruitment. And those are relatively easy things to count. Assuming that you have some kind of relationship with membership between the chapter and the national organization. Some are counting sales, they're counting registrations, things like that, if they have a system that collects that. But about 20% were collecting no information at all. And of course, it's very difficult to assess whether or not a chapter is being effective if you're not counting anything. So our argument would be, you got to count something, but let's make sure we count the things that in fact really count. So I guess, and my next question then would be, what do you count? How do you measure performance? If we could just take a minute here in the chat box there and tell everybody, share with us what you count or how do you measure your chapter's performance? So membership, event registration, recruitment, retention, annual report, local events, state advocacy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, because that's one of those things that's difficult to count. So community outreach and university engagement are a couple of areas that are, again, those fuzzy ones, but they can be very important. And I think that what we fail to or don't take advantage of is the ways in which we can determine whether or not those things are creating value. So Patrick, very briefly, how does GBTA measure performance of its chapters?
So we have, I mean, like you mentioned, the simple, easy ones to measure: membership growth, event attendance, advocacy. We have a government relations challenge. We have event registrations. So it's kind of across the board. And what we started doing with our data is, what data do we have at our fingertips right this minute? What can we get a hold of and start tracking and reporting back on without having to recreate the wheel, without having to really spend a lot of time digging or begging the chapters for information? What an interesting thought that came to mind, Peter, as you were talking a minute ago, was those associations that do ask for annual reports or quarterly reports. What are you doing with that information? Are you actually analyzing the data you're receiving, or do you just take the report, file it away, and wait until the next quarter? My second question back to you on that, or back to the group out here, is, are you reporting that information back to the chapters as well? So as a chapter network, this is the data that we're getting from you on an average. So you could break that down by chapter size, by region. There's several different ways to parse out that information, but I'd like to challenge you all out there. What are you doing with the data that you're collecting? And are you even reviewing it and then sharing it back with the group, and potentially, hey, let's go for a network goal maybe of increasing membership, or an event attendance goal. So it can help foster some positive reinforcement of what they're doing and how they're doing it, and then also push them to achieve new goals. Right.
So one of the difficulties that Peggy and I have often found when we work with associations that are trying to optimize their chapter system is they have a quote-unquote annual reporting system. And they get these reports back, but they're self-reporting. So a lot of times we'll look at those reports, and chapter leaders always tend to think that they're doing great. And how do they know they're doing great? Because they went to a meeting and all their buds were there, and their buds said, "We're doing great." So they have sort of this echo chamber in which they're operating that tends to give them the sense that, wow, things are wonderful, but they don't really have any objective metrics by which to assess whether or not they're doing great. And chapters typically are only touching about 30% of the membership in their space to begin with. So there's 70% of the members that are in their area that aren't being involved in their activities at all. So this whole question of what are we measuring is really, really important. And Patrick, I think there's something unique, somewhat unique from our perspective about what GBTA has in terms of its data collection system. Could you tell everybody briefly about the STAR chapter setup you guys have?
Yeah, so so we have 30 chapters and 9 affiliates. 38 total are on the STAR chapter platform right now. Cool thing, we're on a push to really migrate our affiliates to chapters, and we're getting some really great traction on that. So I'm kind of nerdy jazzed up about adding more chapters to our network. But the cool thing is we worked with STAR chapter to develop what they call portfolio. And so we really have a 10,000-foot view of the network in terms of revenue coming through the system, event registrations, how is membership fluctuating up and down, and then we can really dig in deeper to a chapter by chapter level. So that's one thing that we do every month with our reporting internally, is looking at those outliers of, hey, you know what, our New York chapter just had a spike of 50 members last month. What did they do? we call them up, we connect with them, and then we share their story with the network, because what we're finding is that while, we manage chapters and we manage volunteers and we help them grow their organizations, our membership gets more of a kick out of hearing from their peers, and they're more energized to do what their peers are doing versus being told by national or global, this is how you want to do it. So we're taking more of an approach of collaboration among volunteers versus it all coming from national. Great point.
And I think that notion of being able to aggregate street level data and look at it in total is that's invaluable. That's priceless. But then the other thing, as you noted, is how then you can see the exceptions like New York and really reach out and say, what's different there? How can we replicate that system wide? Because I think that's where if we want to create greater value across our chapter system, we need to find out what's working, what's not, and take the what's not and throw it away and double down on what's working. Okay, let's keep this conversation going here. Just another couple of areas from the report. We took a look at areas of concern, and as one might suspect, alignment was the top area of concern, followed by quality control, then resource allocation and risk management. Interestingly, if you look at most of the reporting systems, they're typically around issues of risk management, not about alignment. They're typically around things: did you file your 990? Do you have insurance? Or do you have whatever reports filled out you're supposed to fill out, as opposed to, are you moving in the same direction that we're moving? Are you focused on mission and member, as opposed to the reserves that you have in your bank account? So I think it's really important we focus on the areas, especially around quality control, that ensure that our members are getting a consistently positive experience no matter where they are in the country, because the members do not distinguish between the chapter experience and the headquarters experience. To them, it's one association, and if the chapter where they live is not doing a good job, that's going to reflect badly on everybody out there. So quality control can be really important. Patrick, what do you guys look at as the number one area of concern from your perspective?
From my perspective, it's really difficult to have just one. I think that these four areas are equally important. But I think I have to say alignment, again, is probably the number one for us. Again, we have the chapter and affiliate model that creates some confusion among members. It creates confusion among our own staff at times.
Right.
So alignment truly is the number one piece there. And your point about member confusion and how the chapters represent global or national, so incredibly true. One of the unique things that we have also is we have the ability for a member to purchase both a chapter and global membership bundled together, but you can also purchase just a chapter membership or just a global membership. So we have this huge disconnect between our chapter members that don't even know that the global or national entity exists, and then we have global members that have no idea local chapters exist. So, and we file that under alignment because sometimes the message coming from the chapters isn't exactly the message that's coming from global or national.
Yeah, and I would reiterate again that your STAR chapter system, and I'm not advocating necessarily for STAR chapter, but I'm advocating for a unified data system. Yes. The advantage of a unified data system is you know what those numbers are. You know how many local-only members there are, how many national-only members there are, or in your case, global-only members. So you have some pretty accurate data about that. And quite frankly, most of the work that Peggy and I have done around the country, most associations don't have accurate data, particularly on local-only memberships. And I think that's a big data gap that we need to find a way to make sure that we fill. Okay, so let's keep moving along here. One of the other areas that often comes up is whether or not chapters are opening or closing associations are opening or closing chapters. And our research suggested that about 20% have added or closed a chapter in the last 5 years. And so there is obviously some level of churn going on. What we don't know is why that add or why that close, for example, happened. I know that, again, in the work that Peggy and I have been doing with associations literally around the world, probably 20 to 30% of the chapters out there are just barely existing. They're there only because they have a charter of some flavor or other, and they're probably incorporated, and they have a bank account. But other than that, they're not much more than some guys that get together every couple of months and have a meeting and then move on to the next meeting. So there are lots of reasons why we need to take a look at that chapter system and make sure that we don't have that 30% that are just hanging on, because that's not getting us anywhere. When they're too big to fail but too small to succeed, that does not reflect well on the system as a whole. So we want to keep an eye on that. In fact, why don't we, Patrick, you mentioned before that GBTA is about to do something around the area of who stays and who doesn't stay. Why don't you share that with everybody very briefly?
Yeah, you know, it's something that we started, and actually we engaged with Mariner Management to help us with this kind of new project that's been ongoing for more than 5 years now. So like I mentioned, we have a chapter model and an affiliate model. We really provide a lot of direct support to our chapters. Our affiliates are a little bit more of a franchise model, I guess you would call it. But we're really taking the position now of encouraging our affiliates to transition to a chapter model so they have increased benefits. We can go back to that point, Peter, we just made a little bit ago about the membership and what the members believe and their interpretation of the global versus local and the message that's being sent. Our members are so confused about our chapter versus affiliate model. We're hearing from them that we don't have a choice, and really, frankly, our affiliates don't have a choice, but we need one system. We can't have multiple systems and multiple models out there. It has to be combined into one, and that's what we're working towards, is a one brand model. But we're getting some momentum, and we're getting some really good excitement from our affiliates about this change.
Excellent, excellent, good to hear. Okay, so let's get to the point of today's call, and that's really looking at this issue of return on investment. So the association allocates resources to an activity, and it's looking at that allocation and saying, okay, what's that bringing back to the system? How are we moving the mission? How are we serving the member? How are we serving the organization from a financial perspective? And the CFO is particularly concerned about the last one of those things, because the CFO is saying, hey, we're spending money, we need to find a way to make whatever we're doing, at least, if we can, revenue neutral. They don't like to see red numbers in their financial reports. Not that we can necessarily get away with not having some areas where that happens, but that shouldn't be the norm, that should be the exception. And it needs to be a pretty abnormal exception for that to be justified. So we take a look at the association income and expense statement, and we talked about this before. I can't tell you how many CEOs I'll ask them, well, how much are you spending on your chapters? And they'll say, well, you know, we're dropping, say, I don't know, $500,000 on staff, and we do another $250,000 on our leadership training programs, and we'd probably drop $100,000 on our chapter leaders portal, and we do some other things for them. And so, you know, let's say it's around $1 million we're spending on them. I said, oh, well, that's great. And how much are they bringing in for you? What goes on the income side of the statement that justifies you spending $1 million? And that's what I get. I get, well, I don't know. Yeah, because, and I'm going, well, that's okay, but that's not what I would call a good business reason for spending $1 million or however much money you're spending. We want to have at least some rational basis upon which to do that. And it's not going to be possible for us to come up with a one-to-one, rock-solid, accurate way of counting exactly what the chapters bring to the association financially. But we can do better than, I don't know. Right? We can do better than I don't know. So let's talk about how we can do better than I don't know. So that's where we came up with the ROI matrix. And the ROI matrix basically goes out and monetizes the value of the chapter activities. Takes a look at each specific activity and says, how many dollars can we associate with successful completion or performance around that activity? And that's used to rationalize the resources. So if I can say my chapters are bringing in X number of dollars and we're spending X number of dollars and X minus X is 0, well, the CFO can live with that. If X minus X is less than 0, the CFO is going to go, hold a second, you know, why are we spending more than we're bringing in on that? And that may be okay. They may say, we'll do that anyway because we feel there are enough enough sort of soft values there that we're willing to live with that. But they need to have some basis to decide how much we're going to spend. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So the matrix actually has two axes, the x-axis and the y-axis. Oh boy, that's geometry? Is that geometry, something like that? That's good fun. So in the x-axis, we look at the activities or the roles that the chapters might play in distribution, marketing, communication, listening, recruitment, et cetera, all those things that we've talked about before. And the y-axis looks at the valuation options. And here we're going to look at the direct value of an activity, how we might price the service, price the volunteer contribution, or look at the indirect value of the activity. So let me make this a little more real for you by giving you a matrix here that sort of gives you some examples of what this looks like. So in terms of the channel of distribution, if the chapter sells, the association sells t-shirts and the chapters sell 10,000 t-shirts and the association gets $1 per t-shirt, that's $10,000 to the association. It's a direct value. It's easy to count, easy to measure, know exactly what went in, what came out. If the chapters do PR campaigns, we can't probably count what's the value of that PR campaign, but we can identify what it would cost us to hire a PR firm to do the same thing. If we look at something like listening, we can't, it's hard to value the quality of the information that's brought back by the listeners, but we can count the effort the listeners put into listening. So here's where we're going to go and say, well, how many hours do you spend on average every month doing your listening? And we can multiply that times some value per hour value that we place upon that volunteer time, and that gives us a number. And then last but not least, we have this question of, for example, here, next generation development, and say the chapters offer mentoring programs which prepare entry-level professionals for our certification. We can identify the increase in participation as a result of chapter activity in that area. And again, that certification program probably has some kind of an income implication for us at the national level, and we can see, well, you know, the chapter does this and that number goes up, and we can associate that change in value with the activity of the chapters. So now let's drill down a little bit here. I'm going to take a look at each of these channels and each of these valuation processes to give you an idea of how the numbers might be generated. So our first example here is what I will call recruitment, where the chapters independently, and I emphasize independently, conduct membership recruitment campaigns. So we're going to measure the direct value of that effort. And here we simply take the net dues that the headquarters gets times the actual number of members that the chapters brought in with their campaign. So if your dues are 150 bucks and the chapters get 50 and the association gets 100, chapters bring in 1,000 members, you just got a big bunch of money. $10,000, nice chunk of change. Now, the rates obviously are going to depend upon the net dues that are given to the headquarters, and there could be some intervening variables. So if the headquarters is running a concurrent campaign, that could affect those recruitment numbers. There could be other variables that would affect the extent to which the membership recruitment programs go well or not so well. Again, we're not looking for perfect accuracy or perfect one-to-one relationship between the activity and the outcome. We're trying to get something better than I don't know. So in this example, and these are examples drawn from actual associations that contributed to the program, this one association, 29 of their chapters ran recruitment campaigns in this 1 year, averaging 28 new members per campaign, and they netted $114 per member, which generated $92,568 to the association. That's a nice chunk of change. And it was one of the things that the chapters were doing. And here again is a place where we have a direct relationship between the chapter activity and the financial income to the association. So let's take a look then at pricing the service. So we mentioned before, the chapters do PR campaigns. And we all know that chapters go out there and they do some kind of public awareness, make some kind of public awareness efforts. Some chapters actually hire PR firms. Most of them just do some kind of, they'll do appearances on radio programs, they'll do public service announcements, they'll do presentations at local universities and schools and things like that to create awareness around the profession, for example. So it's very difficult for us to assess the quality of what they've done. But PR firms typically charge $1,000 to $5,000 a month when they're on a retainer to run ongoing PR campaigns around this kind of activity. So if we just took, in this particular case, the association with 28 chapters that ran fairly simple awareness campaigns, and took the lowest cost for a PR firm at $1,000, and said, okay, the 28 of them did that. That saved us $28,000. That's $28,000 worth of activity that the chapters produced on our behalf. Big number? No, but it's a number. And when you begin to add all these together, as you will see when we look at the GBTA example at the end here, they can add up this pretty substantial amounts of money. And if you have 50 chapters or 100 chapters doing this, again, those numbers tend to go up. Let's keep moving along here. So we talked about listening before. And again, here's an example where we have to price the volunteer contribution because it's very difficult to value the quality or the information that they're actually delivering to us. So if we took the average number of hours that chapter leaders spend talking to members, feeding that information back to the headquarters, and then multiplied that times a number. In this case, we picked $23.56 per hour, according to the independent sector, which is a company or a nonprofit group that does these kinds of assessments for a lot of C3 organizations. Then we, in this particular example, 23 chapters, volunteers spend around 12 hours per chapter collecting information, and they use $23.56 an hour, came up with almost $20,000. Not a big number, but let's say you had 100 chapters doing that and spending 24 hours. Again, all this creates different math, and the math is going to be different from from association to association. So this is where, again, we have a process here that you can use to apply to all the activities of your chapters and get some sense of the value that they're creating for you. And then the last area that I'm going to touch on very briefly is the indirect value of the activity. And this is a place where it's increasingly difficult to come up with a precise number, but you can come up with a number. And remember we talked before about just because you can count it doesn't mean it counts. And just because you can't count it doesn't mean it doesn't count. Well, this is one of those places where it's hard to count, but you can actually count some things that are close to it and generate a number. And so in this particular case, they were looking at the impact of a chapter program, driving mentoring programs, which helped the association get more people into their certification programs. Well, they went and did a comparison of what's it look like in areas where the chapters are making an effort on mentoring against those where they aren't. And they found a 15% higher enrollment in areas with chapters that had mentoring programs. And 66% of their chapters offered those kinds of programs. They net about $275 per enrollee, of which 238 came from such areas. So we attributed 15% of that total to chapters, generating about $10,000. Big number? No, but it all adds up, as we shall see. So why don't we hand the mic back over to Patrick here. And Patrick, why don't you talk me through a couple examples of how GBTA did some valuation. And this is a little different than what I've done. So Patrick here has looked at both direct value, price of service, price of contribution, and indirect value as well.
Sure.
The mic yours.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you. And I'm sorry if I fell off the line here. I'm actually traveling, and of course, in the business travel world, the number one thing that you need is reliable internet, which I'm finding is not the case right now. So I apologize. I hope I'm back and connected well. But this was a really eye-opening exercise for us at GBTA. And I'm not going to lie, I was terrified to run this exercise because I was afraid I was going to get numbers that came back to me that showed we're spending and investing all this money into our chapter network and we're getting a zero return. And then I thought to myself, oh my gosh, is my job going to be in jeopardy? Are they going to cut my budget? Are they going to cut my support? You know, whatever it is. I was pleasantly surprised in some areas. I thought we would be overperforming in other areas. But it's a great exercise. It's something that you should really dig into. But I would keep one thing in the back of your mind. What is your association's goals and aspirations over the next 3 to 5 years? And what data do you have that can help support that to bring your department and your chapters on that journey for association growth? So that's kind of what the mindset that we had as we were walking into this this project of how is it going to affect the growth of our organization. So one of the main things, as we talked about earlier, chapters deliver monthly, quarterly, annual education opportunities to their members, and they apply for CEU credits, and there is a fee. So so the total revenue from members who have received their designations, certifications, continuing education courses is about $600,000. So we have a lot of members that are really activated to get those designations and certifications. So what's pricing the service? So we actually give our chapters and make them automatically approved providers. So we don't charge them that $500 fee to be an approved provider, and we don't charge them $100 per session times the 500 sessions per year that it would essentially cost for them to do that. So we're giving them a benefit of being an approved provider and getting their sessions approved without a fee. So we looked at what that true cost is, because we want to not only look at how much the price of the service is, because we want to know what potentially revenue we're missing out from collecting from the chapters, but also to turn around and prove the ROI to the chapters of the benefits that we're giving them. On average, and this is really more of word of mouth that I was talking with the chapters, we have 4 members per chapter that work 2 hours per month on the programming. And by programming, I really mean identifying the speaker, working with the venue, selecting the menu, writing out the application for the CEU credits annually. How often do they do that? And then, of course, we multiply that by 30 chapters. So the volunteer contribution to this is just under 70,000, which is great. And I found that the biggest benefit to this exercise is looking at what the volunteer contribution is to what they're doing and putting that dollar amount on there. Because when I talked to senior leadership about this, one of the cool things was I kept reiterating, hey, if we had to hire staff to do this work, this is how much money we're saving right now by having our volunteers do the work instead of staff doing the work. So that was a really big benefit for my organization in my example of proving the ROI of needing further member engagement, support the chapters with what they're doing, because we're saving headcount, staff, and benefits all the way around.
So Rachel, Patrick asked, how do you access the data of the section activities? And Rachel, I assume that by section you're referring to you call your folks sections. Patrick calls them chapters. Yeah, okay. So is this something that's done through the STAR chapter system, this data?
We used a lot of sources. I really was surprised at how many different avenues we have data available to us. And by available to us, I mean various departments in the organization, that I had to start going to my coworkers and saying, do we even have this data? Or taking, the people we know that are chapter members and comparing that list to who has their designations and certifications. That's how I derived this information. It was a lot of taking pieces of information that I have and combining them together. It's not that I can just go into our AMS, click a button, and all this reporting comes out. There was a lot of manual calculation going on here, and really piecing numbers together from various sources.
Okay, cool. So let's take a look at advocacy, which I think is one of those areas that people often consider the fuzziest of all. And most associations look at advocacy as a cost center, because it's very difficult to figure out, okay, if we have somebody on Capitol Hill or in Annapolis or Albuquerque or wherever, what's the value they're creating? So what did you guys do to sort of put a number there?
Sure. So we do have a director of public policy. We conduct a legislative summit annually. And that our director of public policy also goes out to the chapters at their request and does, an education session about what's happening on the Hill, what are the priorities for the business travel community. And we also do a government relations challenge where our chapters raise PAC funds for our business travel PAC to help support what we're doing on the Hill. So the direct value of activity, and this was really the easiest way for us to do this, we just looked at how much money our chapters are raising in PAC funds on an annual basis, and we plopped that number in there. Pricing the service, we looked at how much is our public policy salary, the budget, what are the credit card transaction fees and accounting processing time to manage that government relations challenge, and our PAC management system. So we put all of those pieces together of how much does it cost. And then we looked at the volunteer contribution. And this was an interesting conversation that kind of went in circles for a while. But at the Legislative Summit, we have 9 hours of education for the attendees. We have about 150 people that attend. And then when we work with our lobbying firm to help set up the appointments for those people that attend the Legislative Summit, and each person on average has 4 appointments. And granted, the real appointments are about 15 minutes. Sometimes they go a little bit longer. So we just said, all right, everyone has 4 appointments that last about 30 minutes plus 9 hours of education and learning times the 23.57, because I added a penny from the 23.56 that we were using. But the other piece to this that I would also say is if you really want to get true numbers of replacement value of the volunteer contribution, as we talked about a little bit earlier, talk to your HR department and find out when they go through this process of establishing a new staff member, what's their formula? How do they use that? So I really engaged a lot of different departments in my organization to dig deep into these numbers. For 2 reasons. 1, because I needed the data and I wanted to prove it. But 2, I wanted to start educating the other staff in the association about our chapters and about what we're doing. Because I think a lot of times other staff in the organization, they just hear the complaints from the chapters, or they happen to pick up their phone or get an email and it's an unhappy chapter person that you end up having to deal with. But I wanted them to start having a different perspective of what our chapter is doing and the benefits they provide to our organization.
So does GBTA have a state level presence, or is it primarily Washington, D.C. presence?
Really, it's just a national presence in D.C. We have worked with particular states on specific issues when requested. We don't have a lot of state level support, but we do help our chapters at the state level when we're asked about it.
Right. So that's for those of you out there who have an active, whatever your regulatory or legislative framework may be, an active state conversation or even an active local conversation. This is where chapters can play a critical role. And rarely do I see an association trying to place a dollar value on what the chapters do at the local level when it comes to state regulations and legislation. And I think this is one of those places where this kind of model gives you a sense of, okay, we can't necessarily value the negative, that law was not passed, or
right.
The modification, that law was changed, but we can value the amount of time that's spent into that, or we can say, well, if I hired a lobbying firm to go to Albuquerque and Annapolis and all these other places, I know how much that would cost me. In fact, funny side story, we're working with a client in one place, and I won't say who it was or where they were, but they spent, I think it was a little over $1 million on their lobbyists in the state capitol. And I looked at the treasurer and I said, well, how did you decide that $1 million was the right amount of money? And he said, well, that's what the lobbyists told us we need to spend. And Peggy kicked me under the table and said, don't you say another word. But I mean, that's the problem that we have when we're trying to look at something like advocacy, but we need to come up with a number somewhere. So we rely upon, in this case, they're relying upon the quote unquote experts, the lobbyists, to tell them how much it's going to cost to make this happen. But usually we don't have any number at all. We're just saying, I don't know, we need to do it because we need to do it. And I've seen a lot of associations spend a lot of money just because, and that's a hard sell when you're talking to your CFO and your CEO. Okay, so let's take a look at the summary, because Patrick had a number of other examples, but I want to give you a sense of what these numbers can look like when you put them all together. And you can see here that when Patrick ran this for GBTA, and this is a rough calculation here, this is not as precise as what was actually done, this gives you an idea of the amount of money we could be talking about here. It's a pretty substantial chunk of change. And I think this is why it's really important that we do this as an exercise and be able to justify it when we sit down with the CEO and the CFO, and when we talk about why we want to expand our leadership training program for our chapters, we want to add staff, whatever we want to do. In fact, I think, Patrick, didn't you do something as a result of this process?
Yeah, actually, it was really cool. So again, we went into this project with wanting the data. We wanted to figure out where we stood in these different areas, but we wanted to relate it back to the 3 to 5 year plan for the association that the board provided to us, because it's not, sometimes in some situations or some associations, it's not just the executive director that's making a decision about adding headcount. Sometimes the board is involved too. In some cases, that's our model, is that our board is really involved with headcount and ensuring we have them in the right places. So I wanted to make sure that the data that we were analyzing and putting into this model was helping us, and to prove that we needed more help with our volunteer areas. So we went to senior leadership. I did, with my boss. I gave a presentation. It really was very close to the ROI. Our chapters, are they worth it? Because I get that question all the time from senior leadership. What are they worth and why? So now I have the data behind it to prove it. As a result of this exercise, I'm now able to hire a second person on my team that's really going to be focused on volunteer engagement, helping me oversee those our committees on a global basis, because engagement has a direct result to additional revenue to the organization, at least in our case. I don't want to make a blanket statement that everything that works for GBTA works across the board. Something you might find that's not the case in your association, and that's okay. We're all so different. We're all so unique. We just have to start somewhere and then move forward and look at the positives, report the positives, acknowledge the negatives, and see where we can grow those negatives into a positive.
Great points. And so I'm looking at the member engagement number where you value the volunteer contribution, that being the largest number by far of everything out there. And I assume that you talked about having about 1,000 volunteers, and GBTA is a G global association, correct?
Right. Yes.
So is that really looking at the international conversation?
No, this project, in fact, we only looked at the United States.
Okay.
Our global entities are a little bit, the models are a little bit different than what they are here in the US.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we wanted to just start with a smaller subset of data versus trying to get through all of the regions, go out to people all over the world and ask for this data. So we started small. We started with the US with the data we knew we had at our fingertips, and we're working out from there. Yes, is the long range plan to look at this on a global level? Absolutely. We have to. We don't have a choice. It's just a matter of starting small and not taking, biting off more than you can chew.
Great. Because Stacy was asking about how you would measure international advocacy. And obviously, as we become a more global population, global world, that sounds kind of weird, but as we develop relationships outside of our domestic borders, this question of advocacy in places outside of Washington, D.C. is going to become increasingly important.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I agree with it. Right now, we have advocacy, of course, in the United States here in Washington. On a global level, we also have a large presence in Brussels right now. So those are our two main focuses for advocacy. Of course, as we hear from different regions around the world, what's going on in their areas, we get involved, we provide resources, we do the best we can. But really, it's Brussels in the United States right now that we have the largest presence.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. So, got a question for you guys sitting out there. What are you going to do with all this stuff? What are your next steps? Why don't you take a minute and share with us what you think you want to move forward with as a result of hearing today's conversation. Already knew Patrick was brilliant, but this was great.
Who said that? Stacy. Thank you, Stacy.
Actually,
Oh, no,
Lucy
was
said
Lucy.
that.
Sorry.
Lucy was the one who said that. So did you pay her?
No, I don't know. Lucy, have we met? I don't think so, but your check's in the mail.
Okay, so it looks like folks want to go out there and do something like this. So this is great because I think ultimately we haven't got this model locked in any way, shape, or form. There's lots of steps that we need to take as a group to make this better. And so when I started developing this model 2 years ago, I reached out to a handful of associations and we got the initial pool of responses that helped us build the initial matrix. But obviously this is something we want to continue to refine. So our next steps, really working this forward, are to collect some more examples. So I ask all of you who are participating in this program today, and anybody you know, to, as you go through this process, send me whatever it is you put together, because we're trying to build a large data pool of all the different valuation samples that are out there. Because again, we've given you some examples of how this might work, but I'm sure there are other models out there that we might want to look at. And as we look at those, we can monetize and segment them. And ideally, what I want to do is build some templates. And after the program's over, I think Sarah's going to forward everybody a copy of a program that I put together, a spreadsheet that's got an example of how the thing works, and then it's got a form that you can use to begin to do valuation across specific activities that your chapters are engaged in. But we want to build these templates, send them out to people, have them test them, rinse and repeat, forever beta. Because ultimately, we want to be in the position as CRPs that we can, when we go to the CEO and the CFO, we can say, hey, this is why you're spending this much money, and this is how much it's bringing in for you, and this is a good value for the organization as a whole. So, speaking of CRPs, for those of you who missed last year, the CEX, the Component Exchange Conference, will be on October 26th, back at the Hyatt in Arlington again. The registration is $199, and we are getting close to sold out. So if you have not registered, I suggest you get your butt over to leveragechapters.com and register today, because it's a very different program than last year's, and I think it's going to be rock solid in terms of creating opportunities, especially for CRPs to talk to other CRPs about what's working and what's not, and what could be better. And then, of course, Bill Highway's got a number of things coming down the pike. They run their chapter roundtables, and they have a series coming up in August. If you haven't been to one, I highly suggest, highly urge that you go. They'll be in Chicago on the 1st, Rosemont on the 2nd, in the DC area on the 7th, 8th, and 9th. So please get a chance, and if you get a chance, check that out. And then, of course, for those of you who are going to the ASAE conference in Chicago in August, we're doing a version. Patrick and I will be doing another version of this session at the conference on Sunday the 19th. And we'll be spending a little more time having the folks in the room actually do some monetization. And then on Sunday, my partner Peggy Hoffman is going to be doing a component hackathon, which should be a whole lot of fun to really look at how do we hack our components. If you go onto the ASAE website, you can read all about both sessions. So I hope we see everybody there. And with that said, here is our contact information. And please feel free to contact any or all of us. We're more than happy to talk with you about what this effort. I think it's a really important step for the association community to take. And I think that the notion of valuation is one that can be applied not just to the chapters or components of associations, but to a lot of the things that associations do and typically have done just sort of because. And so let's change that because into here's why, and here's the math behind it. Because I think in the grand scheme of things, that will ensure that we do a better job of delivering true value to the member and moving our mission. So with that said, thank you very much for a great afternoon. I believe it's 1 o'clock, and it's time to wrap things up.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Patrick.